Welcome to Domino Theory, the podcast about politics, media, and business. I'm Christian White, and joined as always by co-host Mark Simon. We're also pleased today to be joined by John Yoo, a key legal mind of our time who can lead us through some of the interesting political and legal jousting over TikTok, the Chinese social media app that I would argue is also a potential tool for espionage and political warfare against the USA. But first, the lead-in. The Trump administration is off to a strong start. President Trump has already signed scores of executive orders and set the tone for a radical restoration of the country. Actions range from getting control of the southern U.S. border, threatening imminent tariffs on Mexico and Canada, and firing many government officials. On trade and foreign policy, Trump is turning away fundamentally from globalism and back to a traditional view of how America as a normal nation state should relate to the world. Economically, he clearly intends to use tariffs that served America so well from the first law that George Washington signed, the Tariff Act of 1789, and the deregulation and pro-energy policies that marked Trump won. Culturally, he's taking steps to restore American meritocracy and end the un-American racism known as DEI. Take a step back from the fusillade of executive orders and other actions, and you see a president who is restoring the power of the presidency itself, an institution badly weakened during the 1970s Watergate era and never quite recovered. Ronald Reagan has been long credited by conservative historians for firing illegally striking air traffic controllers in 1981. Certainly, the American people saw that action as decisive and liked it. What Trump has done in recent days is several orders of magnitude larger. It's the most decisive beginning of a presidency since at least the arrival of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Dealers in 1933. It doesn't just feel like the end of a 4-year nightmare that began under Biden. It feels like the end of a 16-year nightmare of stagnation, self-loathing, racism, and Orwellian lies that began with Obama. But no presidency starts out perfectly, and Trump has stumbled in trying to save TikTok, a Chinese-controlled app that can track Americans' locations and force-feed them with hostile media. The original legislation to ban TikTok, if it wasn't divested from Chinese control, passed the U.S. House of Representatives last year by a vote of 360 to 58. On January 18, in a unanimous 9-0 decision, the Supreme Court upheld the government's power to enact this law. The court's opinion outlined the obvious risk. It said, quote, TikTok Inc.'s ultimate parent company is ByteDance Limited, a privately held company that has operations in China. ByteDance Limited owns TikTok's proprietary algorithm, which is developed and maintained in China. The company is also responsible for developing portions of the source code that runs the TikTok platform. ByteDance is subject to Chinese laws that require it to assist or cooperate with the Chinese government's intelligence work and to ensure that the Chinese government has the power to access and control private data the company holds, end quote. That's pretty straightforward and not good. Unfortunately, Trump, who previously supported the TikTok ban and tried to implement one through executive action during his first term, now wants to save TikTok. He signed an executive order instructing the Justice Department not to enforce the TikTok ban for 75 days. Trump also said, quote, I'd like the United States to have a 50% ownership position in a joint venture, unquote. It's unclear if this meant a U.S. company or the U.S. government. It's the latter. If it's the latter, then maybe the government could end up operating a media property that is even more left-wing than PBS or NPR. Trump also said he would consider the possibility of X.com owner Elon Musk or Oracle chairman Larry Ellison purchasing TikTok. No conceivable antitrust considerations there. Some people love the decision. One was a spokesman for China's foreign ministry who said, quote, TikTok has operated in the U.S. for many years and is deeply loved by American users. We hope that the U.S. can earnestly listen to the voice of reason and provide an open, fair, just, and non-discriminatory business environment for firms operating there. Sure thing. This comes, of course, from the masters of government censorship, protection, intellectual property theft, and digital political warfare. A better option might be to put an end to TikTok and the rest of China's political warfare activities and instruments, so many of which are operated in plain view here in the United States and in the rest of the free world. That's the lead-in. To discuss this issue with us, as well as other legal developments in these first days of Trump 2, is John Yoo, a former senior Justice Department official during the George W. Bush administration and a professor at UC Berkeley Law. He'll also be a visiting professor at UT Austin this spring. His most recent book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Supreme Court, co-authored with Robert Dillahunty, was published in 2023. Welcome to the show, John Yoo. Mark, can you please get us started with a question for John?
John, I'm a media guy. I'm consumed with TikTok. What are the pitfalls, first of all, for the president in issuing this order? Secondly, what do we see third parties doing in terms of to try to get involved, whether it's attorney generals or different groups? And then finally, what's your overall opinion of this whole little TikTok the legal battle where they're going to be in here pretty soon?
Guys, first, thanks for having me on. It's great to see you both. And let me say right away, I think that a lot of what Trump has done on his first few days, I guess we're in day 3 now, have been really positive, particularly with national security, particularly with foreign policy. The problem here is that while in general he's trying to refocus us to our main national security rival, which is China. And that's how I read him, wanting to, reduce our involvement in the Middle East, wanting to pull us out of wars in Europe is so we can refocus on what's important. However, I think he might have a blind spot here on TikTok. TikTok is, a popular social media platform, but at the same time, it collects enormous amounts of data on everyone who uses it. That's 170 million Americans. It plays data on where you are when you use it, what you're looking at, right? You give it a lot of permissions. Probably don't even notice when you sign up for the service. And under Chinese law, TikTok is obligated to provide that information to the Chinese government whenever it asks for it. Right? So it allows Chinese Communist Party, in conjunction with all the other things it's been doing, like stealing all the databases. You guys have worked in the federal government ever? The Chinese probably have your OPM file just like they have mine, right? They probably have our applications to be given clearances. They are accumulating huge databases on everyone in the United States. Right? Makes it possible for them to blackmail people, makes it possible for them to identify who they want to influence, makes it possible for them to pressure people we know. It's what an intelligence service would do. So when President Trump was in office the first time, I think he came to the right conclusion. The first time when he found out about TikTok, he wanted it banned or sold. This ban or sell thing was his idea from 2020, 2019. So that's one. So the second thing is, because Mark asked about the law, what's going on right now. The law required as of January 19th, the day before President Trump took office, that TikTok either close or be sold. Under that law, the president had the power to extend that for another 90 days, but that power ended on January 19th. In fact, if you read it, you could say like Congress was almost trying to do Trump a favor, so he wouldn't have to take a position on it. Congress took all the responsibility for trying to close this popular social media site, trying to close off this channel for the Chinese to spy on us, essentially. But President Trump instead wants a deal to be made, and so he said, I order the Justice Department not to enforce the law for 75 days. Now, the interesting thing is this may not solve the problem because the law is written very broadly and has some really stiff penalties. It doesn't just apply to TikTok. It applies to any company that's going to do business with TikTok, essentially. So anybody who distributes it, like Apple and Google, any cloud companies that host it, so that could include Amazon and Microsoft, anybody who carries it, that could be, Comcast, they all are subject to fines. And the fines are not tiny. The fines, believe it or not, are $5,000 per TikTok user per day. There's 170 million TikTok users in the United States. So any company that, is involved with TikTok is subjecting themselves to hundreds of billions of dollars in damages per day. So I think there's a lot of potential legal liability for the companies other than TikTok to continue cooperating them with it, even during this period. So what might happen? I could see, and that's the last question Mark asked, I could see state attorney generals suing. If you think about it, if you're like, I was on a conference call with the Attorney General from Montana. Montana already tried to shut off TikTok. Why is TikTok not any different than any other product that's now illegal under federal law? And TikTok and these companies coming to your state and selling it to you after the federal government said, no, this product's illegal. Could you get away, could you sell a drug that loses its FDA approval and still keep selling it as safe and effective? So states might sue. And then also people who own shares in these companies might sue. Like I own Apple stock. I mean, if Apple starts selling this, you're subjecting the company to potentially hundreds of billions of dollars in losses and fines. Shareholders often sue companies for making terrible decisions, for destroying shareholder value. So that's my last answer is what's going on with third parties is states might sue, even shareholders might sue to stop these companies from cooperating with TikTok.
Right. Well, all right. So I'm not a lawyer and I don't even play one on TV, but my understanding is it's funny when this was coming, being at the State Department, just know a little bit about presidential power. And I think it's extensive. Just being an amateur historian who has read the Federalist Papers. I love the part where Hamilton wrote that. I don't remember the exact quote, but basically that the province of military action sort of defines itself by the action of a single hand. Meaning versus compared to other parts of statecraft, the president is presumed to need and have a lot more power than in other parts of governance. And so when this went to the court, the TikTok case brought by ByteDance or TikTok, I forget, I guess it was TikTok since that's the U.S. entity that sued to stop the law. I was expecting, we'll get 5 votes, maybe 6 votes, who knows, maybe even 7. But it was, if I recall correctly, a 9-0 decision saying that we actually believe that, especially when he is in one with Congress, that the president has is in the best position to make these decisions. Now Trump is making a different decision now, saying you can break the law for 75 days, sort of, which is, I was always told, a U.S. official cannot give you permission to break the law. Maybe you can say, I'll pardon you. Maybe, maybe that would be different. Although I don't know if he can pardon he can't if it's a shareholder lawsuit. Right. So he's sort of out on a ledge and has sort of departed the province of national security and getting into deal breaking now of, the youth love this stuff. My son, who's great, who told me to do the podcast, which I did, and I got so many votes saying, let's save this thing. Really, this is now in the sort of realm of commercial. I mean, I guess you could make a stretch and say Xi Jinping wants this, although there's no real indication that Xi was the one who raised it in their phone call. Apparently, Trump raised it, right? But we're sort of in a commercial dispute area now.
I love the point you're making. So one thing is that the Supreme Court, as you said, ruled unanimously that TikTok had to obey this law. Decision came out Friday. I mean, look at how much has already happened during Trump's first week. That seems like months ago, but that was just 3 days before Trump took office. That's just last Friday. And it's easy for the court to do that because, yes, the president is in charge of foreign policy and national security. You are almost quoting exactly the words of Federalist Number 70, where Hamilton says, the reason why the executive power is concentrated in one hand and one person is so that the executive can act with energy and speed and dispatch. And then he says, as you quoted, and the 2 biggest responsibilities that the president has under our system is protection of the community from foreign attacks and the national security and enforcing the law. But the other point is the president is not in charge of foreign commerce, right? The Congress regulates commerce with foreign nations. And so in this case, Congress has chosen to impose a ban. Right? Actually, Congress gives a lot of power to the president to also impose sanctions, economic sanctions. But that's only because they're doing it for Congress. When Congress itself does it, the president can't overturn or overrule, tariffs and sanctions by Congress. They're the ones who have the ultimate constitutional hand here. So the question, this is really interesting. How can Trump actually say to TikTok, you don't have to obey this law for 75 days? Presidents have been pushing the envelope in this direction, saying, well, I might not enforce this law as a way of disagreeing with the policy of Congress. And this is something actually started with President Obama. You might remember in the DACA bill, this DACA idea, executive order, he said, I'm not going to enforce immigration law for about 2 million illegal aliens in the country. And then the numbers kept growing. President Trump actually tried to stop that. He came into office and said the president can't just pick and choose between the laws he feels like enforcing. And then President Biden put the DACA program back in again. So usually conservatives and Republicans have been the ones who've said presidents have to enforce the laws written by Congress, even if they disagree with Congress's policy. And so this is another question. Like, if you're a company or your state and you're wondering, should we allow the sale of TikTok in the distribution of TikTok? Should we allow companies to participate in TikTok? Right? They're opening themselves up to a lot of vulnerability. What if Trump changes his mind tomorrow? Right? You could think about how much has happened in 4 days. What 4 days from now, Trump says, nah, don't want to deal with TikTok. We're shutting it down. And all those companies that did business with TikTok, we're now going to fine you. You can't, as a company, say, I was relying that you said you wouldn't enforce the law. That's not a defense. So you're quite right, Christian. The executive has to carry the law. It's doubtful whether the president can say, I don't feel like enforcing it. And if you're a company or you're an individual and you're involved with TikTok and you're subject to these fines and sanctions, that's no defense if Trump changes his mind or if the Justice Department comes after you.
My question is, the motivation is what worries me about Trump. In other words, I almost see a New York property developer. I'm in this kind of sometimes in the same business where you just say, you know what? I'm going to park the dumpster right there. You're going to fine me $2,000 a day. I'll pay the fine, but I'll get my building built. And I sometimes worry that that's how he looks at this. In other words, Obama did it, Biden did it, nothing happened to them, and I can go ahead and move forward. And my real concern is, of course, I'm from Hong Kong. My boss is in jail, Jimmy Lai. I've got all these other issues. And the main thing is the collapse of the rule of law. And the one advantage the U.S. has in the international world of commerce is basically a strong rule of law. And now we've actually started to see if a company has favor, if a company's advantaged, then what's going to happen is that basically the president is going to be able to, well, let's just say, go out and do what he needs to do. And companies are sitting there. Do you see this as any threat to the rule of law, or do you see it just as a political issue that's going to be done?
That's a great question. So if you take a bigger step back, there's the over TikTok, our relations with China, but you make a great point. The larger message is that if the executive branch gets in the business of picking and choosing laws to enforce or not enforce because it disagrees with Congress, then what's the certainty? Right? If you're a private individual, you're a business, you're trying to figure out how the laws apply to your business. Do you now have to factor in the whim of the chief executive and enforcing? And I have to say, I have found that Democrats have been much worse about this than Republicans until now. So, for example, I can multiply examples, not just immigration law. I remember President Biden trying to cancel student debt. He still did it anyway. And then, there's another case that has to go back to the Supreme Court to stop him if Trump hadn't won. If you're a private actor in the loan markets, how do you know whether these loans are ever going to be collected or not? In fact, how can you know if you're Congress, what the actual debt is in the United States, are they ever going to collect on these monies or not? So the idea that the president can choose not to enforce laws that have been passed by Congress and that presidents have signed, that really introduces a lot more legal uncertainty. And I agree with you. I think one of the great things about the United States, one of the reasons why so much investment is pouring into the United States is because investors, people do business, employees know that there's a security, that the laws will be enforced, that contracts will be carried out. So there is this longer term threat if we allow the rule of law to deteriorate. I think that would be very poor. I tried saying, for example, when New York went after Trump, remember New York brought this ridiculous lawsuit against Donald Trump for hundreds of millions of dollars because of his accounting, right? Right? And one thing I said immediately was New York is just harming its own ability to be the center of commerce in the country. And you saw all these businesses starting to leave New York and moving to places like Florida and Texas. Because why does someone want to be in New York and be at the whim of such an arbitrary and capricious district attorney and attorney general. You don't want the United States to have that problem when it comes to the rest of the world.
John, can I throw you a curveball, and you can take a pass because we didn't warn you this might be a topic. It just popped in my head while we're talking about China and national security and presidential power, which is that from 1789, when George Washington became president, until I believe 1974, 72, 74, presidents had the power to impound money, that only Congress can appropriate funds. The executive can't spend any money that has not been appropriated by Congress. But the president didn't actually have to spend it all, especially on things that he thought were pointless or no longer necessary, et cetera. And just putting this in today's, and so then along comes the Impoundment Control Act of whichever year, 1974. Richard Nixon signed it, but this was Richard Nixon who was weakened by Watergate and who wouldn't have to live with the consequences of it. And ever since then, except for a few years in the late 90s and maybe 2000, we've had budget deficits. As DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, actually just sort of a commission that will, I guess, advise the president and the head of OMB, the Budget Writing Office of Management and Budget. As that comes around, I mean, hopefully you can get Congress to actually make some cuts, but maybe not. And wouldn't it be nice, or maybe it's necessary, for example, for the president to cut some of these legacy defense systems that are enormously expensive and no longer pertinent, especially after the lessons of the Ukraine war, to what a war with China would look like, to preparing for that war, and then hopefully not making it occur. To deter that war, a pet rock of mine is I love aircraft carriers. When I fly into San Diego, I try and sit on the left side of the plane so I can see if any are in port. Love visiting them, love going to the Midway Museum with my kid. But these are $13 billion
targets.
Yeah. Targets. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's before you add the air wing. And, whether it's taken out by 200 drones or one of these new Mach 17 missiles, cruise missiles the Russians have, what if the president, I'm curious about reasserting that, whether it's OMB, just saying, basically, hey, we think that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional, that what existed for 200 years before that should exist today. And if we have to go to the court, we will. What do you think just sort of about both the politics and the law?
That's really interesting. I mean, the politics are a winner. The law is harder, but let me start this way. Presidents are allowed to have their own interpretation of the Constitution. They don't have to accept Congress's. And in the area specifically you're talking about, budget and spending, presidents and Congress continuously fought from the founding, as you pointed out, over the power to actually spend the money, right? Jefferson, for example, was appropriated money to build out a navy that was no longer necessary after we had made peace with the French in 1798. I, by the way, think we should never have made peace with the French, but nevertheless, we've made some of these serious diplomatic errors over the years.
Entirely.
Right? So he said, I don't need to spend the money anymore. So I'm just going to let it sit. And nobody thought that was a serious constitutional problem. No one thinks presidents should spend money wastefully. So that went on, as you said, all the way till Nixon. When Nixon became president, he was so weakened by Watergate, he had to accept, in fact, has passed over his veto, the Budget Impoundment and Control Act, which forces the president to spend every dollar, even if it's wasteful, even if remember the bridge to nowhere. Even if Congress says build a useless bridge that actually doesn't connect to anything, the Impoundment Act requires the president to do that. So politically, I think it's a good call for, as I believe he has, the nominee for OMB, Russ Vought, to say, we're going to try to see whether the Supreme Court still thinks the Impoundment Act is constitutional, whether we reconsider it based on this long history we have had of presidents fighting with Congress and it never being settled. The legal issue is there's a Supreme Court case that clearly upholds the Impoundment Act, also decided very shortly after the law was passed. And Trump is doing this in all these other executive orders too from this week that I don't think people realize what he's doing. He's actually taking positions in other areas that are confrontational to the Supreme Court. They're saying, I'm going to hold a position that's contrary to what the court has said because I want to prompt a new challenge to the Supreme Court and get the court to change its mind. And presidents have always done that and long done it. And that's, I think, what President Trump is doing with the Budget and Impoundment Act. I would say in the end, he has more flexibility, or he should have more flexibility than people think. I don't think the president could, for example, say, I'm not going to spend any money on aircraft carriers, even if you appropriate them. But he could say, I am going to not spend the money wastefully, and I'm going to save the money. And if we don't need the aircraft, if we don't need 5 aircraft carriers, then I'll build 4. And you can reconsider it and come back to me. I think, there's always been that play in the joints when the spending is wasteful and not in the national interest.
And presumably the area of national security, as with Jefferson sort of today, would be the one where a court would probably be more inclined to give the president power than as opposed to, say, welfare spending.
I mean, the national security is a place where the president's power is at its height. National security and foreign policy and law enforcement. And so, if Congress tried to force the president, these are things we thought about when I was in the government, but suppose the Congress ordered the construction and deployment of inferior weapon systems that were actually more harmful to our soldiers, more vulnerable than the ones we already deploy. I think a president and his commander-in-chief could say, I'm not going to increase the risks to our soldiers and build inferior tanks when we have better ones already available. And you know what? And I don't think the courts would step in. They would let the president and Congress fight that one out. Yeah.
Right.
That's actually a very interesting point when you go back. I think of J.C. Watt and, and the fight that they had over that big cannon. I can't remember the name, but,
the Crusader.
You couldn't name it that today, but Crusader. Yeah.
Crusader. And I remember that. And I still remember when J.C. left. And I still remember, I'm old, the argument that people were having. And, it's the same as the Osprey. How many times did we have the Osprey flying around and keep going and going and going? And, people would talk about that. That's a very interesting argument. That would be interesting to see if Trump would take that. He would make a bold argument. The one thing I will say, I'm not the gentleman I work for now, but I worked for a gentleman in shipping years ago. And the lawyers, the Admiralty lawyers in Hong Kong, I had the biggest Christmas basket of anybody because we were a gift to God to the Admiralty legal profession because Dr. Chin would, very, very active in the courts. And I have always thought that actually is not the worst trait for someone like Trump. I don't mind the litigation. I think the fact of the matter is we have to be in there fighting it out, hunting it out. It is one of the things that kind of amazes me about the D.C. area. And sometimes it's almost they treat every decision as if it's settled law. And, you can go back. They always say the Constitution's living except for what they don't like to be living, But let me ask you another question. I want to get back to national security with TikTok and with some other things. Where do you think the president, we see the president now with other social media companies. Do we think that could extend into, in other words, they can start to look into other social media companies and say, you know what, you also can't have accounts from this country. You also should block these people. Do we look at it going in that direction? Is that a possibility that he could have that type of thing? In other words, we're not going to let you can't upload any accounts from China. You can't load any accounts from Russia or, for example, that always comes to me, especially with the Palestinian cause and Al Jazeera. If you follow some social media, there's always people saying, we should be blocking Al Jazeera, blocking this. I'm not a fan of that myself. In other words, if the platform's open, I think everybody can be on it. But I am starting to hear more and more of that as let's block certain things. I mean, what's your thought on that?
No, yeah, well, this is actually TikTok's challenge to the law forcing its sale or closure was not really that Congress didn't have the power. It was what we've been talking about. Did Congress have the power? Did the president have the power? In fact, they basically conceded the federal government could shut down any business from abroad if it wants to, which I think is correct under the power to regulate international commerce. But what TikTok said, is essentially the argument you're raising is there a free speech problem? Is there a free speech problem in allowing Congress or the president to shut down networks? It's not just TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, Google. A lot of these networks, their main currency and trade, their main service are speech. Right? So the interesting thing that the Supreme Court said, which I think begins to address your question, is that in the TikTok case, all the law really did was to say foreigners can't own TikTok, right? If domestic people bought or ran something just like TikTok, that would be fine. It has nothing to do with what's being said on TikTok. And so the court said, what we really worry about is if the government comes and says to a social media company, don't publish anyone who criticizes the COVID lockdowns, right? Which actually happened, right? Or someone says, don't publish people who criticize the government. That's when the First Amendment, that's when free speech really gets triggered. But what the court said is the way this law worked was it had nothing to do with what was being said on TikTok. Nothing like going after Al Jazeera because it has a certain point of view. All it was doing was trying to say, we don't want a foreign government to own this. And so one point I made I wrote this in a little piece earlier this week was, yes, TikTok is collecting a lot of information on us, making it available to the Chinese Communist Party because of its Chinese ownership. I'm not saying that companies can't collect that information. Google, right? Facebook, Twitter, they're all collecting similar, Amazon, Microsoft, they're all collecting information on all of us too. The government is not trying to stop that. All it's trying to do is to stop foreigners from having access to that. That's the national security link that allows Congress and president to do this. So, I would worry more if the government was saying, you can't have any speech on a network that's critical of Israel or critical of Palestinians. That's when the government gets into trouble with free speech. But that's not what happened here with TikTok.
Can I throw you another one from left field or maybe right field, if you'll take the pun, which is birthright citizenship. Again, we didn't prep you on this, but it's just in the news. And, being a knuckle dragging right winger, amateur historian, just think the Constitution is meant to be understandable, plain language. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There was a joke in the late 90s before we started winning politically and in court on the right to keep and bear arms that we need another amendment, like the Second Amendment. It says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And this time we really mean it. With birthright, thank you for laughing. With birthright citizenship, I just never gave it much thought. I thought, it says, if you're born here, then you're an American. But you see these things like Chinese who will sort of manage to be here just for the sort of 6-week window in which they may give birth. Yeah. Birth tourism and things like that. And there has been a move. I think it's emanated from parts of the new right. I know my friend Michael Anton, who was a teacher at Claremont and had destined for policy planning at the State Department. God bless him, dealing with those that interesting organization. The in-house State Department think tank might be a contradiction in terms, but at any rate, I'm just curious if again, sort of the politics and the law. It's going to be played. It looks like it's going to be litigated since there's already, I think, an injunction against Trump's executive order. What are your thoughts on where this goes?
I don't share the view of our Claremont friends about birthright citizenship, but it goes actually to the point I was making earlier about the president being allowed to have his own constitutional view. The Supreme Court has its view. Congress may have its view. The president is allowed to say, I interpret the Constitution differently, and I'm going to order the executive branch agencies to follow my view until the other branches try to stop me. This was Lincoln's view, amongst others. It was Andrew Jackson's view, Teddy Roosevelt's view, George Washington's view of the presidency. And so I think that's what Trump is doing. I don't think he's going to win in the end. I think in the end, the court will just say, this has been the traditional rule. As you say, this has been the rule since the founding. People who want to overturn that rule have to have, I think, some pretty good evidence to overthrow it. Go ahead.
What do you think of any modifications? So, for example, even Andy Kim today, very liberal senator from New Jersey, even he said, look, the birth tourism is a problem. These factories in Saipan and places like that. Do you think that could be specifically addressed? I think that's what people really are objecting to.
I think the bigger problem is allowing people into this is just a symptom of the real problem, which was the lack of controlling the southern border. So if you look up the numbers, this is maybe last year, I think the estimate was there were 150,000 babies born in the United States last year who did not have citizen or green card holders as parents. Biden was letting 3 million people in a year cross the southern border without restriction. So this is not really a problem. What the problem is allowing people across the border in a unregistered, an illegal way. There might be people coming over on visas, but you could actually cure for that by saying we're not going to issue visas to to women who are pregnant, and that would solve the issue. I think in most part. I really think this is symbolically important issue, but in terms of consequences, in terms of fixing the immigration problem, it's not going to really make that much of a difference compared to building a wall and enforcing the immigration laws, removing people who are here illegally, primarily people who are committing violent crimes and felonies. The interesting thing about the constitutional issue that you mentioned is the text. I don't know. It seems, and this is why we haven't had a different rule. The text seems pretty clear. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. So people who have the contrary view, like Michael Anton and our friends at Claremont, they say subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That phrase means your parents have to be citizens. This is not the way this language has ever been read and wasn't understood that way. In fact, it's a very strange way to say, and your parents have to be citizens. They could have just said, your parents have to be citizens. So actually, if you look at the history, that phrase, you're born in the U.S. and subject to the authority of the U.S., the biggest group of people who didn't fall into that category were Indians. Because at that time, Indians were considered under our law to have their own sovereignty, and they were not considered subject to our power until much later. So this clause, for example, excluded members of the Foreign Diplomatic Corps, and this just seems silly to us now, but back then, right after the Civil War, they worried about it. It also applied to the members of occupying enemies. So if Germany invaded the U.S. and their soldiers had kids, they would not be citizens. They would not, because they were not subject to it. So these were actually real world problems back in 1868. Indians, they just fought the Civil War, foreign enemies, foreign diplomats. So that's what that subject to the jurisdiction of language means. But it's an interesting thing. The Supreme Court upheld this in 1898. President Trump he said, I think that Supreme Court decision is wrong. And he's entitled to say, okay, we're not going to give out passports. We're not going to recognize citizenship for these babies. And he's going to, get a case. It'll probably be, as you said, there's a federal judge just today enjoined it, the order. It will get up to the Supreme Court fast. And maybe that's what Trump wants. And maybe he'll lose, but he wants to say, I'm taking every aggressive measure I can think of to stop the flow of illegal migration across the southern border, even this smaller one.
All right. Well, again, reprising my role as a jailhouse lawyer, it's sort of reminiscent a little about the Second Amendment fight. They used to say that the preface that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Oh, that means the militia, that's the National Guard. And no. The militia, the National Guard, that was a pre-World War II-ism. The militia, as the founders understood it and explained very clearly in the Federalist Papers and in other contemporary documents, means sort of all of the people, potentially excluding a few officials. So, yes, to reinvent something and say, all right, point to me where this was written, why that was argued that way, the jurisdiction thereof thing. It's an interesting point you make about excluding the offspring of occupying foreign military powers. Just thinking of the Hessians that the great George Washington had killed on Christmas morning.
Yeah, I grew up in Philadelphia, near a town called King of Prussia, so I still worry about this stuff.
I just think it's fat. I mean, the one thing is it's kind of obnoxious to me. I mean, that nobody wants to go out. I mean, this should be exciting constitutional battles. We're having debates and things like that. It's amazing that the discourse on our evening TV is such that, basically they take it right down and talk, first thing we do go to is somebody crying that, they couldn't get in, or they go on Monday and say they couldn't get an appointment on Monday. And it's like, well, yeah, the federal government's closed. Of course you couldn't have gotten an appointment on that
Actually,
Monday.
Can I make a point about the immigration thing? this birthright citizenship, it's very symbolic. I don't think the consequences are big. Meantime, I have to say Trump has engineered a revolution in actually how we think about the southern border, because and his critics are like not paying attention to it because of birthright citizenship, right? 22 states filed against birthright citizenship. But the real main change is that Trump declared an invasion was occurring across the southern border and has deployed the military to seal the border and to start removing people and to build a wall. That's never happened before, right? The use of the military to actually carry out, right, I think, security operations on the southern border. I think it's constitutional because we're talking about what are the basic functions of government for the president. I would think, right, protecting the nation's borders would be number one, actually, before anything else, before you get to other things. But that almost has gone by without anybody really. Chris, President Trump just ordered 10,000 troops to the southern border. That's amazing. It's not going to be ICE, border agents alone out there. It's going to be, the 101st Airborne Division. I think that could be a really serious deterrent to illegal migration. That is such a much bigger revolutionary change. But everyone's focused on, as you say, on birthright citizenship and crying people not being able to get appointments. That is so small potatoes compared to this, I think, is revolutionary change with the turning it into a military problem, not a civilian law enforcement problem.
That's fascinating. Let me ask, because I know you've got to go, but let me just ask you a question. And if your wife runs out and pulls the plug, don't blame her. Is there any thought of yourself maybe down the road into the administration? Have you thought about a position or thought about
based on what I just said about birthright citizenship, they may not let me in. You just thankfully, hopefully identified a major issue I disagree with them about. But, as you said, I agree with a lot of the other policies. The use of the military is really interesting. It's something, we've been debating in the academic world for a long time, but Trump's the first president to actually do it.
I don't think Trump cares what his lawyer thinks. He just wants a really good lawyer. And I think that's why he'd be very well served, you know what I'm saying, to have someone like you in there to argue some of these cases down the road. I mean, also, but like I said, I sit in the same, not position, nowhere near, but my attitude towards government services is like, I'd love to do it, but
it's people don't realize that it's very costly on you. You're not making the big bucks anymore, right?
No.
Really,
I mean, look, it's like I used to work for a guy named Jim Broyhill. He was a congressman, then a senator. And one time I was driving him around, which was the extent of my high priced and experience back then. And that's how long ago it was. And I was telling him, I said, I brought up a congresswoman, and I said, well, what do you think? And he goes, Mark, Democrat, he goes, that's the best job she's ever going to have. She's never going to have a better job, because we were talking about getting somebody to run against him. And we were going through a list outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, of all these great lawyers. And he was going, which one of those guys is going to give up his $400,000, $500,000 a year job to go earn at that point in time about $105,000? But anyway,
plus just the icky bureaucrats you have to deal with. Some are very fine Americans, and others just drain the life out of you. We had a saying that after about 6 months after people leave the State Department, they look much younger, healthier, happier. So I recommend leaving the State Department. John Yoo, thank you so much for your expertise. Thank you for your service to our country and your expertise and commitment to the rule of law. Hope you'll join us again soon. That's it for this episode of Domino Theory. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.